Good afternoon, and welcome to Flair Capital's Expert Roundtable. Today, we are excited to be joined by 7 inspiring leaders as we discuss one of my favorite topics, building world-class teams, starting at the earliest days of a company's story to growth stage and eventually exit, and the organizational priorities along the way. We'll explore best practices in recruiting teams, empowering them, and engaging them, particularly in a remote world. I'm also thrilled to be hosting this webinar as we celebrate Women's History Month. So thanks for joining, and we look forward to connecting after the session. As I mentioned, we are very fortunate to be joined by Addo. He's the CEO and co-founder at RubiconMD, and previously designed payer and market success strategies for Fortune 500 companies before jumping into the startup world. We also have Jung. She's a partner at Oxeon Partners. Mia has spent 23 years building effective and diverse teams in the medtech sector, and now serves as a human capital advisor to many of the leading CEOs and investors in our industry. Carolyn Magill is here today as well. She's the CEO at Flair Capital portfolio company Aetion, and successful entrepreneur who's the former CEO of Remedy Partners and senior leader at Evolent Health and United Health Group. Matt McCambridge is also joining us today. He's the CEO and co-founder at another one of our Flair Capital portfolio companies, Eden Health. Matt was a technology and software investor at Insight Venture Partners before founding Eden. Sonia Milson is also here with us today. She's a chief commercial officer at Maven Clinic and marketing, sales, and business development expert, previously holding leadership roles at Flair Capital portfolio company Iora Health, as well as Best Doctors, Health Dialogue, and United Healthcare. Barsha Rao is here with us today as well. She's the CEO at Nurex and seasoned entrepreneur and executive who is the former COO at Clover Health and Airbnb's head of global operations. And last but not least, we have Tuck Rickers. He's a managing director at Russell Reynolds Associates, where he leads the San Francisco office and technology officers practice. So without further ado, I'll hand off to our Flair Capital partners, Bill Geary, Michael Greeley, and Dan Gebremedhin, as we ask our panelists a few questions, starting with Bill. Over to you, Bill.
Margaret, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. And we'll start our discussion focusing on the early days of building a great team. And so I'm thrilled to bring up 3 impressive entrepreneurs who are leading industry-defining organizations. So we have joining us on the stage, Gil from RubiconMD, Matt from Eden Health, Carolyn from Aetion. Thank you so much for being with us. Carolyn, I'm going to jump in and start with you. You've been the critical team at a couple of early stage terrific companies today, part of the founding team at Evolent, of course. After that, CEO at Remedy. We're privileged to be backing you as CEO at Aetion. So we're curious to learn from you how you go about assessing the need for and recruiting the senior most adds to your team, and how do you infuse the culture that you want to develop at Aetion?
Yeah, thank you for having me here today and all of the insightful questions. Looking forward to the conversation. This is an interesting one. I think one of the first things that we have to do as new leaders in an organization is listen and learn. Again, an appreciation for what stage is the company, what are the skill sets of the existing leaders, the founders, where are their gaps, and you also have to be really critical in thinking about yourself and what you bring to the table, or frankly, what you don't bring, so that you can think about the best way to supplement. The organizations that I have joined in their earlier stages have been very different. So I wouldn't say that there's one prescriptive approach to follow. When I joined Evolent, we were effectively just a founding team, and I had to build a department of 100 people starting from scratch. When I joined Remedy, the organization was already over 350 employees, and the leadership team was primarily established. And then here at Aetion, it was in the middle. We had some leaders, we had some new challenges that required different levels of experience. And so I think the first thing is to be a student and really assess where there are the biggest gaps and prioritize among them.
How do you find those best team ads?
The first thing you do, and I swear I'm not just saying this, is reach out to the people in your community. And Flair Capital has been just a tremendous partner for us in that regard. Oxeon, connecting with Mia and just other people in our circle has been important. And then of course, you're drawing upon your experiences in previous organizations. The thing I would say is once you've prioritized what your needs are, really pressure testing those assumptions and starting to talk to people and starting to picture what they bring to the table. Someone said to me early on, appreciate everybody's fatal flaw. So what is something you're all enamored with an executive that you can bring onto the team? What can't they do? And is that something you can live without or you can supplement in some other way so that you're very honest and candid? And then I find working with the right recruiting partner is absolutely critical. And then, like I said, Bill has been very active in interviewing and helping us to assess and also helping to leverage the network that's just been incredibly valuable.
Gil, over to you. You've built an exceptional team at Rubicon, and I'm going to share some quotes from Glassdoor about Rubicon. Now, these are not ones that you posted. Great culture, supportive leadership, motivated team, exciting idea, incredible team. So how did you pull that off?
Yeah, first, thanks to Flair Capital for pulling this together, and thanks for having me. And also thanks for picking the good quotes in there on our Glassdoor. I would say, jokes aside, I think the important thing about building the culture and the people organization is being intentional about how important that is. For us, I think you get to a stage in building a company where your only leverage is your ability to recruit great people and get out of the way. And so I think there you have to start from the beginning, well before you've gotten to that stage, and really be intentional about what are the values that matter to us. How is that reflected in our brand? What's the brand out to potential hires and employees for us? And then make sure that is reflected in all parts of your hiring process and then within your culture. I think for us, we weren't always, great at it. We started out with this basic thought that we're fun people, so we'll have a really fun culture. And I think the commitment to it is a necessary but not sufficient criteria. And so I think we had to come back and we had to really invest. We had to bring on people who could reflect that, who could spend all their time thinking about culture, who could make sure that our values reflected who we were, make sure that our Glassdoor was reflected the values that we expounded, be intentional about a lot of the other strategic elements, comp philosophy, building in career progression, making sure you're really investing in the people. And I think it's looked different at different stages, to Caroline's point. But as we've evolved up our business, we've had to evolve up all the pieces of that to make sure that we're continuing to recruit great people. Because I think at the end of the day, that is really our only leverage as an organization.
Yeah, that's well said. Matt, you've got a great group of advisors, investors, board members around your company. We're privileged to be on that journey with you. But what role do you see board advisors playing? How can they help you shape the vision, mission, guide the leadership team?
Yeah, it's a great question. It goes through phases as you're building your company. When we were starting out, I really was resonating with what Carolyn was saying about thinking about what you don't know and what you need. So in the early days, speaking for Eden, just Eden, we had a credibility gap and also an industry knowledge gap. I was leaving venture. I knew that world. I knew from the outside in about building kind of software companies. I was learning about healthcare. And so thinking about the kinds of folks that you want to put together, we ended up putting together everyone from chief medical officers, former chief medical officers of large organizations like Oscar, and folks who've done deep in the operations of groups like the Visiting Nurse Service or other types of heavy operational organizations, to folks who are more sort of industry experts in the field, and ended up with a great group, and then clinicians, I should say, as well, who are innovating on the way care is delivered. So thinking about what that group is in the early days and where you have your gaps. So as I mentioned, for us, we'll call it credibility and industry knowledge, and really building that. But we had a unique vision for how we were going to go about that. Fast forward, and again, Flair, thanks for being part of our journey here. I think that the understanding what you're looking for and what you need from investors. So from my standpoint, I had been on the investment side. So the core thing I was not looking for was more relationships to investors, but other folks might really have that as a core need, actually, because of course you're going to need capital as you scale. What I was looking for were people who were really buying into the vision for the long term. In the case of Flare, who had deep connectivity into areas that we were more limited in, hospital systems, in insurance carriers, in that piece of the world of more institutional large healthcare organizations. And then on the advisor side, I would say what we're mostly looking for is people who've been in our shoes. And different phases ago, you're going to go through different types of these things. But in the one case, people who've been in that early days of starting up and you've got your whiteboard and you're trying to figure that out. And then later on, maybe you're looking for somebody who's an expert in your particular go-to-market, whether it's a new go-to-market or just a more scaled up version of your current one. I think that a shorter version of what I just said would just be understanding what you don't know and then trying to find what those are and knowing that it's going to develop and change along your journey.
Yeah, no, that's great. Carolyn, as you've built the high caliber team at Aetion, what's the right balance between the time you spend recruiting senior management team ads and everything else you have to do? And when's the right time to bring in a dedicated people officer?
Yeah, these are also questions that have been top of mind over the last few years. I think of my priorities as a CEO along our operating framework that by now you're very familiar with, Bill. But we think about it in terms of 5 things: team, delivery, short-term growth, long-term growth, and performance, sort of board management, scalability, and the like. And I think at any point in time, you have specific areas of focus that are taking more of a percentage of your time. And so being thoughtful about how you're allocating your time is important. In the early days, I'd say the focus is on, we just talked about that, your initial assessment. Where do I have the biggest gap? Where's the best way to complement what I can bring, and hire that person? So I think in the early days, you're really listening, learning. Team was probably 60% of my focus for my first couple of months. And then very quickly it turned to other priorities. And so I think it does fluctuate over time. With respect to hiring a chief people officer, we have hired an incredible one, Dave Vavrasek, who came to us from Capsule, where he had been scaling a very high growth team and just incredible results in a short period. And those skills have been invaluable for us here at Aetion. I don't think we could have attracted him or someone his caliber had we tried to do that sooner. And I don't know that we were even as ready as a company to recruit as many people at that pace. So I do think there's a balance. We didn't necessarily need him right out of the gate. It was once we got our sea legs, we had a sense of who we were, what our go-to-market strategy was. We had the platform up and running. We had some customer testimonials. Those were things that really took priority in the early days. And then once we had them, it was appropriate to recruit in that chief people officer and then just scale the heck out of the business.
That's great. Terrific insight. Gil, maybe just segueing to co-founder, your story started at MIT. That is the story of RubiconMD, if I recall correctly, with your co-founder, Carlos. What advice would you give people as to what they should look for in a co-founder, and what advantage, what leverage did that give you organizationally?
Yeah, I think there's 2 areas to think about, or 2 dimensions from a co-founder perspective. So my co-founder, Carlos, and we met at an event called Hacking Medicine at MIT. And I was pitching the idea for RubiconMD. And I don't know if there's maybe 100 people or so that were there to work on the idea over a weekend. And I worked on it with 6 or 8 people, reached out to him afterwards and said, we'd make a pretty great team. Let's continue to work on this. I'm building the business. And so I think we ended up, I call it founder dating for about 3-4 months before we actually incorporated the business. But during that time, I think we were looking at, both of us were evaluating a couple of things. One is how well we fit together and working. And I think that's on the value side. So making sure that there's really good value alignment between yourself and this person, because I think if I were to rank, I think that's actually the most important. And then the second piece is skills. So are we complementary in terms of the skills that we have? So you don't want perfectly overlapping, but you also don't want so far apart that you can't be in 2 places at once, which is part of the benefit that we have. And so I think we were evaluating on those two dimensions. I think if I look back now, making sure that we were aligned on the values we cared about, the things that matter to us, what we were trying to build, the problem we were trying to solve. We don't have to be exactly aligned on what we want out of life, but there's got to be at least some complementary and shared understanding there, and appreciation and respect. So I think having those in place is a core piece. There are a lot of thresholds that people look at, making sure this person has a certain level of intelligence, that to start a business requires a certain level of grit, and that you need those things as well. I think those are easier to suss out in a more standard type of interaction. But I think if you don't have the values piece, you're not going to get very far in building a business together, and you're going to see that relationship fracture. And then the second piece that I mentioned is being able to understand how your skill sets overlap but are different. I think to a lot of people on the outside, Carlos and I look very similar, both MBAs with business backgrounds, but he takes a much more operational approach. He's a lot more in the details than I am. And we both can sell, we both can be in the weeds, but he does that piece more. I tend to take more of a people relationship approach. We both have a lot of the same things in our DNA, but we have a complementary skill set that was important early on when he was really running the product and the operations, and I was on the other side really out helping to sell and build the initial relationship. I think having those two pieces, and then the one other thing I'll say is the way in which we did this, I think in hindsight was appropriate, where if you don't already have a deep relationship, Matt and Scott knew each other for a really long time, being able to give yourself the opportunity to get to know this person. We worked on a couple kind of time-bound projects together to really understand how we work together, I think was really important.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's terrific input. We're going to segue now. We're going to ask you to go backstage, sit in the green room for a second. We're going to bring Mia from Oxeon Partners up and continue our discussion. So Gil will reconnect with you at the end. So stay where you are. Mia, welcome. Great to see you. Really appreciate you being with us. We're going to segue now from the earliest stages to fundraising. And maybe right before we do that, Mia, I'm going to jump in and kick things off with a question to you. Certainly an advisory board can be a really powerful resource for a young, emerging, rapidly growing company. And so what's your advice to a first-time founder as to how to build an expert advisory board, how to construct that? Where do you get the leverage, and what role, obviously, do you guys play? You've certainly seen that movie a number of times before.
Absolutely. But first of all, Bill, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be on the panel with all these incredible executives who are successfully tackling some of healthcare's biggest challenges. And I've had the good fortune to work with all of them in some capacity over the years. So thank you. And so to get to your question, Matt did a great job, I think, on touching on it. And I think he's a gold standard in terms of building an effective advisory board. I think as a new founder who is thinking about the best thought partners with the most critical and nuanced, I call them superpowers, to surround themselves with as they build their company, it's really important for these founders to start with a goal in mind. What are your goals as a founder or as a business? What challenges do you anticipate? And what are you looking to achieve by bringing on advisors? And what I typically see are founders who surround themselves with 3 advisor phenotypes. And again, Matt touched on this, but just to double click on it, there are functional and industry experts, subject matter experts, and relationship experts with relevant relationships in the market, depending on the go-to-market strategy. And I think when you think of functional experts, back to Carolyn's point, you think about as a CEO, what are your fatal flaws? What are your gaps you might have as a founder, or what your executive team might have as you think about scaling your company? And whether these are marketing advisors, finance advisors, technology advisors, the 2 examples that I get quite a bit of are CEO mentors. So back to Matt's point, I've had several requests for CEO mentors who have founded and scaled a healthcare company successfully, who can help you think through the various challenges ahead, managing your board, raising money, scaling the organization, how to allocate equity. And another popular advisory request I get is for the voice of the customer as an advisory member to use as a sounding board as you build your sales pitches, your marketing materials, your pricing strategy. An example of that, we had a client whose company sold into CHROs and had asked to be introduced to the former head of benefits for Walmart. So we made that connection. Industry expertise, which Matt talked about. We're seeing a lot of tech founders come into the healthcare space. So obviously bringing in somebody who understands the healthcare ecosystem. Subject matter expertise, if you can see around corners and think, is cybersecurity going to be important to you? Will you have compliance issues? Do you want to bring somebody on that has those expertise? So that's what we typically see as you're building out your advisory board.
That's great, super insightful. Carolyn, what about making critical hires around the financing? What advice would you give other entrepreneurs? Make those ads before the financing or make them after a financing?
Again, I think it depends on the stage. And I would argue if you're stage A or B, Series A or Series B in terms of fundraising, probably just having as a Series A or even B, depending on how big you are for your B, having the CEO and the founder really click is likely sufficient. But I do think that it helps if you have at least one hire that you've made as a CEO to demonstrate, oh, I can attract really strong talent here. I don't think you have to have built out the entire team, but I think it does send a strong message to the potential investors that you have the capacity to present the vision and get really compelling people to join. I think that's important. That said, I don't think that you have to have recruited the full team, certainly not at that stage. But when you start approaching a C, now the expectations, a Series C, the expectations are higher with respect to what you're doing, your unit economics. Like now it's really time to scale this business. And do you have people with a proven track record or people that we can really believe in with respect to building the company? So I think it becomes more important. What we found is that hiring right after a fundraise in the early days worked for us. So I came in right after the Series A with Bill. It meant a lot to me, frankly, that Flair was an investor. And had it been an investor that I couldn't have back channeled as easily, I might not have been as willing to take the chance to come over to the organization. And then I think for the Series B, once we brought NEA on, it became much easier to recruit new people. Incidentally, it was also a signal to our customers. So keep that in mind too. The caliber of the investor really matters in that respect as well. But it meant that we not only had more cash, but we had a vote of confidence from organizations that people really respected. And it meant that key executives were willing to leave cash behind from much larger established organizations in a trade for equity to be part of our vision and our startup run. And so it also helps to maybe save some of your builds for after a raise so that you can recruit that caliber who's going to take you to the next level.
Super helpful. Matt, you've raised, 4 financing rounds now successfully at Eden Health. You were at Insight, of course, before that, so quite familiar with VC fundraising. What advice would you give to first-time entrepreneurs? What lessons have you learned now about how to raise capital?
Yeah, I feel like I could take this question in a lot of different directions. Gonna try to not make this 25 minutes long. But I think that first off, I think in healthcare right now, I think if you just go to Tiger Global and you just have a pitch deck, I think that then you've basically raised your round. But just kidding, they've made a lot of great investments. But in terms of institutional, I would say that it's going to be, I've seen it actually be surprisingly specific to the company and what exactly is going on with that organization. I think that Carolyn had a great point in terms of just the overall arc of A, B, C, and C. You're really looking for, you're just investing on traction and revenue, and the metrics are much more obvious at that point. But early stage, if you are an entrepreneur who has getting great early traction, just show I think you really got to understand what's going to sell. And I think you can really show the numbers at that point, and that can be your platform for raising money off of. I think that if you don't, let's say, have that, it's too early for that, maybe you've deeply lived the product for an extremely long time, and or rather the problem, and you then know what the solution to the product is. Focus on that and that thesis and go to deep experts in the space, as opposed to maybe a more generalist sort of technology focused group who doesn't have deep healthcare experience, but is probably going to try to lean a little bit more towards numbers and high level kind of market. I think healthcare is also a little bit tricky because you have a group of, if you know just a little bit about healthcare, then that can be dangerous in some ways because you might be drawing the wrong conclusions. So as you're thinking about your partners, who are out there, I think interrogating their understanding of the market and how aligned you are. You don't want somebody who's investing along a thesis, but learning more and more. And so in 2 years, are going to have a totally different perspective, and all of a sudden you're not aligned anymore. And that's a problem in of itself. And just to hopefully recap somewhat successfully here, I think about where your key assets are, and then understand in the healthcare space how deep of a knowledge base your investors have, and start to try to target those groups based on what kind of phenotypes they hit. And then of course, you get a lot of revenue. That's the best of all worlds.
Fantastic. All right, the four of us are going to jump backstage, and we're going to segue to our next section, which is really more about growth stage companies. And I'm going to turn it over to one of my partners, Michael Greeley. So Michael, off to you.
Thank you, Bill, very much. Great discussion. I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes with three very distinguished panelists, and I'll let them join the stage. We're going to talk about scaling, which oftentimes growth exposes certain stress fractures in organizations, compounded obviously as we emerge from the pandemic. We have portfolio companies that have almost doubled in size in terms of headcount in the last 12 months, and yet many of these people have never actually met face to face. So we're entering into a fascinating next number of months. Anyway, pleased to welcome Tuck Rickards, a good friend of mine, senior partner Russell Reynolds, deep in the middle of a number of industries in transition. Tuck and I went to the same college and business school, and years after graduating, we realized we had the same freshman year dorm room. Varsha Rao, who's CEO of Nurex, has had an extraordinary career on the consumer side, senior executive Airbnb, and at Old Navy. Prior to this was the CEO of Clover. And Varsha and I met nearly 25 years ago, and I recruited her out of college. Not to date either of us. And then Sonia Milson, currently Chief Commercial Officer at Maven. Sonia and I have actually worked together for a number of years. She was a Chief Growth Officer at Iora Health, one of our portfolio companies. It was a very sad day when Sonia recently left Iora from Maven. But anyway, let's jump into it. Tuck, I'll start with you. All of us on the Zoom, I think, appreciate historically healthcare has at times struggled to incorporate technology. We're at this profoundly interesting intersection of technology and healthcare, obviously exacerbated by the pandemic. What are your observations as you're talking to companies going through this transition? I have a specific question about recruiting, and what are the hardest talents to identify in companies that are scaling? Maybe you could comment on both of those.
Sure. Michael, as others have said, thank you for pulling this together and the chance to join. I really appreciate it. It's interesting. I've spent now 20 years after being an entrepreneur in this recruiting business across sectors. And I guess if you look at consumer financial services, early adopters, they were very willing to take kind of platform technology folks and bring them into their spaces. And healthcare was not. And if you go back even just 10 years ago and think of what did healthcare IT or digital health mean, a lot of that was hospital systems, closed systems, HIPAA issues. I need someone who gets our space. And I think the mindset was, we're going to bend technology to our needs versus there's this very powerful engine we could adapt and use in a more open architecture kind of way. And if you think of healthcare now in the world that you invest in these companies that we're talking about here, which is everything from connected devices to analytics around providing care to consumer digital health, to deep tech kind of data analytics, R&D, and life sciences. That's a completely different landscape. And I think we have hit kind of a paradigm shift where teams are needing best in breed kind of platform technology experience. I still find there's many roles, whether it's the CEO roles or certain commercial roles, where it's a complex space. If you don't have that pattern recognition in certain roles, you need a hybrid of tech meets healthcare. I think that the mindset, though, that we can use more of an open architecture approach and have diverse hybrid teams, which put together great healthcare specialists and great technologists in a very agile way. I think that's a paradigm that makes more sense to me going forward. And I think we see that kind of playing out.
And for your clients that are in this scaling phase of development, what are some of the more prevalent searches, or what are the harder searches that you're confronting? What's the talent gap?
So the talent gap goes from all levels, I think, and it picks this kind of new hybrid world we live in, and it's finding the intersection of very specific healthcare domain experience and very specific technology experience, whether it's business experience of technology or technical experience. So we look at the board work we're doing, and it's very diverse around, I'm a consumer healthcare play. I need to get away from healthcare or tech experience into very consumery front end experience, for example. You look at CEOs and you look at the number of technologists from outside of healthcare who've come into this space as disruptors. I think that's a trend we'll continue to see, but as a business scales, they find they need more and more domain experience. So I think the CEOs have to sit on both sides of that. Some of the positions are very bespoke around whether you get into deep R&D or clinical roles, but other ones like CFOs or other roles which are about scaling, or technology roles, I think are much more open kind of platform. So I think that the areas that are very active for us are the core platform technology piece, which is a bit more sector agnostic, then the market-centric pieces, which are very specific around kind of knowledge, a forward-looking mindset kind of in space versus being necessarily an outside tech background.
Yeah, and let me turn to Varsha then. Given some of those observations, you had this extraordinary run in the consumer space. How did that translate? What were some of your observations? We see a lot of talent trying to move laterally. What's your advice for those people trying to get into healthcare?
First of all, Michael, thank you for having me as well. Great to be here. I would say that healthcare has been just a learning journey for me, because I entered in because of the mission, having left Airbnb, and felt like, okay, what would be equally, if not a more mission-driven experience? And I think healthcare is absolutely the place. But there is a lot of domain knowledge that makes it very complex. And so for me, I actually went to Clover Health for about a year and actually learned a lot about everything around compliance and regulatory and some of the constraints that you work within in a regulated environment. And then I left because I just felt I was not being able to use my consumer, like the 25 years of consumer background. So coming to Nurex has been a really good balance for me after having spent some time at Clover, because I can really leverage and flex a lot of the consumer learnings that I gained over decades, but apply it knowing like how to work within a environment where you have HIPAA important regulations that are there for good reasons around like HIPAA and compliance and all the Stark rules and all of that, which are there for, I'm an absolute believer that those things are there to protect the consumer and they're really important. And so knowing how to navigate all of that is really important. And then also that helps you identify the kind of talent that you need. And we've got an incredible GC at Nurex who comes from a decade of experience at McKesson. She helps partner with me on areas. And of course, we use a lot of outside counsel, as every healthcare company does. But then I think some of the harder roles that we've had to try to fill are areas, you know, I brought in a new VP of product recently. And how do you find a VP of product who really gets healthcare, but also gets innovation? And so I think we brought in someone most recently who was at Fuzzy Health, but before that was at 23andMe, and she's just got this incredible blend of backgrounds. But then I think equally challenging is bringing in a chief medical officer who also understands how to work with technologists, because you're trying to innovate on how to deliver care, what you should be able to do, what you shouldn't be able to do. And so we were actually able to, it's like the hire I'm most recently proud of. We just brought in a chief medical officer who came from Oscar Health, but before that was a White House physician, Dr. Jennifer Pena. And she's just, again, got this great leadership and impeccable clinical credentials, but then spent a little bit of time at Oscar Health, so understands the startup world and how do you work with the technology side. So I think that blend is the secret sauce of how you try to, it is a puzzle.
Yeah, it's wonderful insights. And Sonia, obviously, you've had a longer run in healthcare, but you've been associated with more of services businesses. To Varsha's point, how do you think about those models, missing competencies, core competencies as they scale, and the overlay of technology in the services world?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, want to say thank you. It's great to see you and spend time, and appreciate being included today. Yeah, I think ultimately healthcare is complicated. And when you really think about the varied stakeholders, payers, providers, and employers, it's important as you're continuing to scale to really get that domain expertise. I have a variety of that, having been in the healthcare industry for a long time. And even when I joined Iora, I was the first person who really had any national payer experience at the organization, right? And so really thinking about those intersections. If you are a services organization, ultimately the patient will have intersection on different parts of that ecosystem. And so for these organizations, we have to be able to think about what those experiences look like and ultimately understand from a patient experience perspective, also from a technology perspective, data reporting and contracting. Putting yourself in the best position with those relationships, with those contracts is incredibly important for the scale and growth of these organizations. And so I think it's really important that you're, again, hiring for that diversity on your teams and making sure if your go-to-market is provider and you've got relationships with payers, you're hiring people who've got great, deep payer expertise. The same is reverse if you're working in the payer space and want to be working with providers. And so really ultimately creating that together.
Sonia, as the services businesses scale, what are the early stress fractures that you think reveal themselves? Just drawing maybe on the Aeora experience or maybe an experience, where are the gaps that quickly emerge as they scale?
Yeah, I think the biggest is, again, with the patient experience. So ultimately, how do you think about that from the provider payer data integration perspective? Those are the times where people want to make sure that there's a seamless experience. And that's a gap that is often brought forward quickly. Another one is around regulatory components and compliance, particularly if you're going into government programs and Medicare and Medicaid and understanding just the requirements there. And just, again, having that expertise. I think that's also where gaps often are exposed in terms of there. And then last is really just reporting and data, the infrastructure and the way that the systems are working, right? Payer systems in a certain way, provider EMRs in a certain way, it's still highly fragmented. And so the ability to be able to really, again, have coordination among all of those to have a really great patient experience is really where I've seen those gaps throughout my career.
Varsha, you're obviously seeing hyper growth. You're introducing new products, it feels like, every week. And congratulations for that. What kind of stress fractures are you seeing or are you anticipating with that scaling growth?
Yeah, I think we're really excited to launch dermatology just this past week, or in the last 2 weeks. So it's, again, every time you launch something new, it does require the whole organization to scale, because it's not just the new thing that gets added, the whole business gets a little bit more complex. And so I would actually say another role that I've found a little bit challenging to find the right fit for in an organization is this operations leader. We have a great SVP of ops who we brought on board last July now. And he's got this incredible background he's actually a pharmacist by training, and then he went to business school and worked at Walmart. And please, nobody recruit him, but he is able to, so he really knows pharmacy operations well, which is one of our key parts of our ecosystem, but has also he knows insurance and reimbursement, which is a really complex part of our world. And then he also has just great leadership skills, and so has overseen customer experience. And so from my perspective as a CEO, I can trust a lot to have him at the center of a lot of things, because there's a lot of intersection where insurance comes into play with kind of sourcing and then delivery of experience, and he can sit in that. And I think you can probably just imagine it, having been an operations person, not in healthcare, without any insurance background or healthcare background, this role is really hard to do well in. And you don't even know what you're missing sometimes. And so I think it's been great for us to find that balance. And I would highly recommend, if you're in healthcare, to find a operational leader who has a good mix of tech and healthcare, because
Talk just in 30 seconds, because we're out of time. And any interesting innovation in compensation for scaling companies that you would flag?
I would say
I was directing that to Tuck, just as the recruiter in the audience. Sorry.
I would just say quickly that the startup companies to growth are not a 4-year project anymore. They could be the biggest company in their industry with huge market caps. So I think just playing the long game on an equity structure, which lets people continue to stay motivated and scale with a company, is a big deal. There's also kind of inflection points in this market where cash does step up to be competitive for the A players in the market. I think there's a more systematic step up of that to evolve the businesses. You can't view these as startups, and you may be selling to even a financial buyer and need a fully baked team to take it to the next 5 years. So I think it's a long build cycle, not episodic.
Apologies for asking the most complicated question at the end. We could spend an hour on that, but I want to thank the three of you. I'm going to turn the mic over to Dan Gebremedhin, one of my partners. Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Michael. I really appreciate it. I will be running the anchor leg of our roundtable today. We'll be covering two really important topics: diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as the future of the workplace. We've brought Gil and Mia back to this stage. Sonia, I'm going to kick it off with you. You've been at several thought-leading, innovative organizations in your career. I can imagine you have seen an evolution in how we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some of the companies you've been at, Maven, Iora, Best Doctors, Health Dialogue, have been so focused on innovating in the market. And you talked a little bit earlier about like customer diversity, but oftentimes the internal diversity within the organization hasn't come to the forefront. So I'd love to get your thoughts as to how you think about the philosophy of recruiting with keeping diversity and inclusion in mind.
Yeah, first of all, Dan, thanks for including this part in the panel. I think it's so important. Candidly, I've been in healthcare for almost 30 years and often been the only brown woman at the table in leadership, right? And so we're really starting to see this as an important part, and it's only going to make all of us better. Maven's amazing. We have an incredibly diverse culture, and I really give a lot of tribute to Kate for building that and the inclusivity aspect of it. And I think now more than ever, 3 million women have dropped out of the workforce because of COVID. And so we need to be really thoughtful as we continue to recruit and build teams in terms of thinking about that. I think ultimately, when you're building high-performing teams, you want that diversity, and it really needs to start from the very beginning and thinking thoughtfully about who are the types of people that you want on the team. And I think you need to be continuously recruiting and be really opportunistic, and sometimes, frankly, make hires in advance of when you might need them because you found the right person and you found the types of people that you need to be on the team. And being, again, thoughtful about that up front, I think is really important as we're trying to build bench strength. And we know that ultimately it brings better healthcare outcomes and financial outcomes and returns for these companies. There is so much research that shows diversity at the top is really what drives the best financial outcomes ultimately, which for all of you investors, I think is incredibly important as well, but also for all of us who are shareholders in the companies that we're working in.
Yeah, no, that's such a great insight in terms of when you find a great person, you may not necessarily have the role, but hire them anyway, because you'll likely need them as the organization scales. And it's such an insightful comment. Gil, you've built a really great diverse team at RubiconMD. How have you done it? Are there internal metrics that you hold yourself and your team accountable when trying to recruit with DE&I in mind?
Yeah, and we just echo Sonia. I appreciate the fact that you guys have put this front and center within the discussion. So I think we've done a couple things, and I think the first thing we started with was saying we're not the experts, right? I'm an expert in being a Black man, but that doesn't mean I know, and there's very strategic approaches you have to take to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I think it's important to really give it credit to do this well. You have to take a very thoughtful and strategic approach to it. And for us, we definitely measured it. And we measured it not just by thinking about how many women do we have, how many minorities do we have on these factors. We said, how does it look at all parts of the organization? So what does it look like at the top? What does it look like in the boardroom? What does it look like in our engineering team? Places where it's historically harder. So we measured to see, and we're looking to see, we want to be, and I think people externally will credit us with being really good at this, but we don't want to rest on our laurels. We want to always look at least like the US Census. In my mind, if our company doesn't at least reflect that, then we're not building towards the level of inclusiveness and diversity that we're aspiring and expounding. So I think we did start by saying, how do we look? And again, making sure that we're not just taking the easy way out by just cutting and saying, how does the company look? But we're looking across different parts of the organization and different levels to make sure that we're building in diversity throughout. And then the second part, I think, was around how we invested in it. And I think we had to be very clear about why we're investing in it. And I think that is one of the things that I think coming out of the racial and social injustice and unrest of last year, I think it became very in vogue. And I think a lot of people are investing, and it's good. I absolutely think it's right. And I'm happy to see that. But you should be investing in it not because you're doing it and you have to, and it's important, but you should be investing in it because it is the right thing to do, and it will make your company better so you'll win in the marketplace. And if you're doing the former and not the latter, you'll get sussed out eventually. So really being like clear, this is why we're investing in this. And then obviously the next step is to make sure you're investing. So we thought about, how do we do our sourcing in a way that increases the funnel? Then how do we make sure that through the hiring process, we're building in the right things? And then how do we make sure through the rest of the employee life cycle, through retention, that we're investing? Because at all stages of the employee life cycle, you can lose people. If you do a great job of hiring people, but you don't have an inclusive culture, on the back end, you're going to lose people. You're not going to retain the people, the talent that you need. You're not going to see the impact of that upfront investment in sourcing. So we've really put people who are responsible, accountable, and are held accountable from metrics at all parts of the employee life cycle. And we've seen thus far that we've been able to, by putting the measurements in place and investing there, we've been able to kind of show the results over time.
Yeah, no, really insightful. This concept of benchmarking against the US Census, not thinking about diversity across an entire organization, but going department by department, level by level, I think is really important. You talked about experts. Maybe Mia is the expert that we're looking for around recruiting teams. Mia, you've been very involved in the Break Into the Boardroom initiative around driving gender diversity into VC/PE-backed companies. How are you seeing the market evolve? What are the best practices that are really leading into our search processes today that you're involved with?
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more than with Sonia's comments. And I want to give Gil and his partner, Carlos, a huge shout out on this topic. It's not easy in a venture-backed company where it's so fast paced. And I was fortunate to share an office with them for a few years and was just always inspired in all of the breadth and depth of the diversity throughout their organization. So I think Rubicon is a gold standard. In terms of what we see in the industry, we co-founded Break Into the Boardroom with Deerfield about 5 years ago with the goal of decreasing the gender gap in privately held healthcare boards. And as a result of this initiative, we've now placed 33 women to date in privately held healthcare boards. The majority of these placements have really occurred over the past 2 years. So to your question, we still have a lot of work to do. I'm not happy yet until we reach parity, but I would say that team's trying to really replicate the success of Break Into the Boardroom via accessing and advocating for and connecting to all underrepresented healthcare executives. So to go back to your initial question, what we're seeing in the market from a board perspective is an absolute surge of inbound requests for diversity via our investment partners. And I think there's a few factors resulting in this surge. Obviously, the horrific events of last summer that Gil touched on, which has really put a spotlight on racial inequity and made everyone reflect on their own personal professional realities and responsibility, and really being held accountable in the market, through organizations, through LPs. I think the second factor is the market dynamics. With so many healthcare companies bringing on new sponsors or looking to go public, it leads to expanding their board beyond investors, bringing on independent directors. So looking really closely at diversity with different functional industry expertise, in addition to gender and ethnic. And the third piece I see is with so many innovative models being built, the CEOs and investors have really taken a hard look and realized that their boards don't reflect the communities that they serve. So that's what I'm seeing in the market. And then to answer your question on how companies are accessing and hiring diverse candidates, I think Gil tapped into it, really being thoughtful about who you're sourcing. I've seen companies have success in sourcing diverse candidates by proactively building bridges to various organizations or affinity groups. And given we have Break Into the Boardroom and over 200 executive women, we get a lot of these calls. And a great example is of a CEO who went to Stanford. He worked at Maine and DaVita. And when he landed his first CEO role, he had several well-qualified male peers who looked like him from his network call him and ask to sit on his board, and give him massive props. But it would have been easy for him, but he had a reflective aha moment where he stopped and he said he knew that this very pattern had created the flywheel that had resulted in the lack of diversity. And he intentionally sought other networks and sources to pull ideas from. And so we ended up introducing him to a fabulous candidate who brought diversity to his board and representation of the customers that he serves.
Wealth of knowledge there. Really appreciate that, Mia. This concept of sponsors now really driving a lot of this change is super important. And this concept of building bridges and channels and kind of pipeline programs of really talented candidates, I think makes a ton of sense. And again, we'll echo Michael's thoughts earlier. We could have a whole hour on this section because it's such an important topic, but we do need to transition. So I will ask for Matt and Carolyn to come back to the stage for our final topic, which is the future of the workplace. And Matt and Carolyn, you guys are perhaps two of the most important people, in my life, my work life, I should say. I've had the privilege of sitting on both of your boards. Matt, we made the investment early last year prior to the pandemic. And then I'll never forget one of the first calls I got from you, I think it was like in March, April, the height of the pandemic. And it was, I have the opportunity to close a contract in the Midwest, but I need 4,000 thermometers by next week. Help. And you've been through such a harrowing experience. Eden Health is a clinical organization. You've been managing employer clients who've been battling with COVID. Internally within your departments, people have been battling COVID. How have you kept your finger on the pulse and managed the team as it's scaled without sacrificing the culture and Eden being a great place to work?
Yeah, you just brought me back there to that time. And really over the course of the last year, it's been a massive privilege to watch our clinicians manage through the process of keeping both our patients as well as the employers and places where they had their livelihood safe. And it's honestly been a huge sacrifice that that the pretty much entire team has made, from the people on the front lines with the clinicians to the engineers who are staying up late and making sure people have what they need. So I think in healthcare, you have a unique opportunity to connect people to the mission and what you're trying to accomplish in a really meaningful way. To go back to what Gil said, is you actually have to believe in it and believe in your mission. And because people will suss you out if you don't, but you've got a great superpower if you do, and the ability to connect your employees to that. So the way we've thought about architecting this, and we spend a ton of time on it, is thinking about the mission statement, which guides everything we do, the vision, which is what are we going to look like in a few years, the strategy statement, which is a year time frame, and then into how you manage on a daily, monthly, weekly, quarterly basis. And we have the scorecarding model. It's an adapted KPI format. And then your values, right? How do we treat each other? And then figuring out what are those touchstone moments throughout the course of your week and year where you can reinforce that, and reinforcing that like way more than you expect. You're constantly talking about the mission. There's a moment earlier on in the company when people were quoting different, our mission as a company is to do this, which wasn't the mission. And I thought I was saying the mission a lot. And then I just ramped up how much I was saying the mission, like 100% more times. And that kind of changed. And we even do daily stand-ups for 15 minutes with the whole team. So I know we don't have that much time left. So I'll just mention one other piece of this is thinking deeply about how to keep your employees on the same page and onboard them effectively in a virtual environment. Count me as one of the people who didn't think we were ever going to be a virtual company who's moved to a fully virtual first model. How do you keep those touchstones the same and not bias against somebody who's not catching somebody at the Keurig machine or whatever, and figuring out what those are, keeping the consistency, and then these kind of ritualistic moments that reinforce your culture even in a distributed workplace.
Oh, really great insights. Carolyn, last question for you. You have a results-driven culture, but you still have a way to keep work-life balance important. At Aetion, it's always listed as one of the best places to work in New York, one of which during the time of COVID, you've instituted the Aetion cheer. I'm going to do it. Aetion. Yeah, so how do you keep a results-driven culture, but still manage work-life balance, Carolyn?
Yeah, we do recognize people as people, and Matt said a lot of things that resonate. I think anchoring on our North Star, which treatments work best for whom, how much should we pay for them? That kind of orientation has never been more important than during the pandemic. And I think people feel that very deeply. And so that, coupled with our mission and then our commitment to values, helps. We communicate, Dan. And even when we are experiencing like, oh my gosh, we are stretched. Right now, we're working for multiple vaccine developers. Every minute of every day, there are big asks of our team. And that takes tolls on us, on our families, et cetera. And so even if we don't have all the answers, being willing to talk about it, we're Slack shop. We do monthly meetings all together. We do a rally once a year, in person usually or remote. we have phenomenal swag. But I'd say the main thing is really about just staying connected with each other and experiencing those highs and lows and not being afraid to be honest about everything we're experiencing as we're experiencing them.
Yeah, no, it's so impactful. People sometimes say that, oh, this digital health boom that's happening during the pandemic, is it warranted? It's companies like yours that are on the front lines getting us through the pandemic. And so I think we're all extremely grateful for the work that you do. With that, I'll ask for all of our panelists to come back to our virtual stage. Really want to thank you for all of your great insights and wisdom. I was furiously taking notes. I think Matt and Carolyn, you're going to hear some of these tidbits when we get back into the boardroom. Such a great conversation. And to our studio audience, really appreciate your participation here. This is the second of our roundtable series, and we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear additional topics. What did we miss? Look forward to potentially working with you soon in the future. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Take care.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.